Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch program. We're so glad you could join us. If y'all are here in the auditorium, we just ask that you please mute your cell phones. And if you're joining us on Zoom, please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. We will have a Q&A session for everyone at the end of the lecture. I want to thank the Friends of the Museum of the Albemarle for their continued support for educational programs. If you're interested in becoming a member or need to renew your membership, you can stop by the front desk. Also, a reminder that the next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, April 2nd at noon, featuring author Laverne Davis Parker. She will discuss her new book, Manio During World War II and the Manio Boat Building Company. So that program will include both a lecture and a book signing out at the museum shop. So that's again on April 2nd. Now today we welcome Amanda Irvin. She is the program coordinator at Historic Edenton State Historic Site. She will tell the tragic and inspiring tale of Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman who was determined to fight for herself, her children, and later for others. The Harriet Jacobs autobiography is also available for sale in the museum shop if you have not read it yet. So I will turn the podium over to Ms. Irvin to share Harriet Jacobs' story.
Hello, everyone. I'm short, so I'm going to turn this down a bit. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Amanda Irvin. I, as Noah just said, work for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. So I work at Historic Edenton State Historic Site. I am an historic interpreter and the Sites Program Coordinator. So I'm honored to be speaking to you guys about Harriet Jacobs today. The title of my presentation was inspired by Harriet Jacobs' resilience and determination to do what was right, whether it was for herself, her children, her family, or people she didn't even know. So I hope that today's presentation will leave you feeling intrigued and perhaps want to learn more about Harriet Jacobs, a woman of conscience. Before I dive into Harriet Jacobs' story, I would like to familiarize you all with some terminology that I'll be using. Some of these are not universally known. So the terms listed here are generally thought to be the most humane and correct terms to use in teaching and writing about slavery. Though again, they're not universal, but this is to move away from the previously accepted terms that were constructs of enslaving society or created by male abolitionists. So therefore, terms discussing slavery and freedom through the period tend to reflect how the dominant society viewed African Americans and their efforts towards freedom. These all stemmed from the dominant view that, of course, enslaved persons were property. For example, they would use the term fugitive because they viewed the actions of the enslaved person as criminal. While the term slave isn't inaccurate, it does take away from the humanity of the person in bondage and creates impersonal dialogue around the men, women, and children who were forced into the system of enslavement. So we use the term enslaver to hold those accountable and for those who actively kept another person in bondage. And again, emphasizes the active role of people in power who use this labor for their own economic gain. So Harriet Jacobs is pictured here. This is actually one of only 2 known photographs of her. So I'll be taking us through a chronological narrative of Harriet Jacobs' life, both before and after her emancipation. It was a lot to condense into a 45-minute presentation, so I hope you'll understand if it seems like I'm moving quickly through the years of her life and perhaps oversimplifying. So Harriet Jacobs was born in 1813 to a mother and father who were both enslaved. Record keeping of African Americans is notoriously sparse in this time, especially their lineage. But we do know who Harriet's parents are and who enslaved them. The children born to enslaved women were enslaved themselves, as it was a law that the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So this is the case with Harriet Jacobs, who was born into slavery to Delilah Horniblow and Elijah Knox. Enslaved persons typically took the last name of their enslaver, though this is not always the case. Harriet took her last name from her paternal grandfather, who was here, Henry Jacobs. This was to honor her father's memory and be sort of a tribute to her father. The question marks that I have here on her family tree denote uncertainties in her lineage, but there is enough evidence to show that this tree is correct. Edenton, which is of course where Harriet Jacobs was born, was laid out as a town in 1712, and it came to be one of 5 official ports into colonial North Carolina. So this port is where any enslaved person shipped by water to Edenton would have arrived. The vast majority of enslaved persons in Edenton did not come directly from the west coast of Africa, but rather from within the 13 colonies, or from the Caribbean islands, also known as the British West Indies. In the early 1800s, when Harriet was born, Edenton had a population of around 1,500 people, and over half of them, around 800, were enslaved. African Americans in Edenton were generally either forced to work on plantations surrounding Edenton, or as household or domestic workers, sometimes called domestic servants, for the white population that was wealthy enough to afford enslaved labor, and they sometimes did both. The fishing industry of the Albemarle Sound was highly lucrative and almost entirely relied on the forced labor of enslaved African Americans. Many plantations surrounding Edenton had fisheries connected with them, and those enslaved on the plantations could be forced to work in those as well. It was in this time that Harriet grew up in the tavern, Horniblo's Tavern, which is pictured here. It is right next to the 1767 Chowan County Courthouse, as we can see here. B denotes the courthouse, and this little building on the corner is the tavern. So growing up in this tavern, she would have known all that was going on. Though Harriet says in her autobiography that she was fondly shielded in her early life, there was little her family could do to hide the violence and inhumanity of slavery, as Horniblo's Tavern functioned as a hub of Edenton's enslaving society. And when Harriet was 6 years old, her mother passed away, and this was when Harriet came to realize, just 6 years old, that she was enslaved and considered a piece of property. She does speak kindly of her enslaver, Margaret Horniblow, who ran the tavern, and even considers her a motherly figure in her life. Despite it being illegal, as is shown here in the slave codes of North Carolina, this is from 1831. Despite it being legal, this was not heavily enforced until a couple of decades later. Harriet was taught how to read and write. She was taught other skills like sewing as well, which helped her in her future endeavors, which we'll see later. These are actually some of the dolls that Harriet made later in her life for children she cared for once she made her way to New York. So we'll learn more about that later. So Harriet was 12 years old when Margaret Horniblow died. Harriet's family expected Harriet to be emancipated through Margaret's will on her death, which it was possible to free an enslaved person through a will, but instead she was passed to Margaret's 3-year-old niece, Mary Matilda, daughter of Dr. James Norcom. So this is Dr. James Norcom on the left-hand side, Mary Matilda, his wife, on the right-hand side. And of course, Dr. Norcom will become an infamous figure in this story. Harriet worked in the household, primarily caring for the 3-year-old Mary Matilda, while doing other duties to help keep the household clean and running smoothly. In just 3 years, however, when Harriet was only 15 years old, Dr. Norcom began sexually harassing her. And Harriet lamented how he whispered foul words in her ear. It's quite a famous line from her autobiography. As a caregiver for her toddling enslaver and as a domestic worker, Harriet was hardly able to avoid Dr. Norcom as much as she would have wanted to. She recounted how he seemed to lurk around every corner. Mrs. Norcom, instead of coming to Harriet's aid, became jealous and vindictive towards Harriet, adding to her misery. We find out through Harriet's narrative that Dr. Norcom was a sexual abuser who took advantage of Harriet's vulnerability. We often see these power plays in relationships between enslaved people and their enslavers, enslaved women in particular. And this quote here, it says, "Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women." So this quote here in no way downplays the trauma experienced by enslaved men, but instead highlights the wrongs, sufferings, and mortifications peculiar to the experience of enslaved women. From the country's founding, the United States' dominant European American culture included a patriarchal ideology which imposed a simplifying gender binary of male and female. Yet, when intertwined with the aspects of, with the impacts especially of enslavement and racism, this ideology classified and treated African American women starkly different from white women. So it denied them any relative privileges of their gender. So this was an enslaving society that both degendered and highly gendered enslaved women's positions. In such, enslaved women were expected to participate in the same arduous labor as men, while also serving as mothers to create the next generation of laborers. A key objective of enslavement, especially that of women, was that enslaved women's reproductive labor ensured the next generation of people in bondage. When Harriet was 16 years old, she fell in love with a free Black carpenter, but Dr. Norcom refused to allow the marriage, and as the father of Harriet's enslaver, he was able to do this. Harriet afterwards began a relationship with Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, with whom she had two children, Joseph and Louisa Matilda. I will go ahead and say there is no concrete evidence that this picture is of Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, but I have him here. She described her relationships with Sawyer, who was a wealthy white lawyer, as something to triumph over my tyrant in that small way. Because Dr. Norcom was a physician, his rank was high in town, but it fell well below of a man like Sawyer, a descendant of the colonial aristocracy. Norcom borrowed money, lots of money, and often, and when he failed to pay his debts, the court authorized the sale of his property, including those he enslaved. We don't know the nature of Harriet's relationship to Samuel. Though they may have been attracted to each other, there is nevertheless an element of hierarchy within their relationship. And it's highly doubtful, from what we can see in future narratives from Harriet, it's highly doubtful that Samuel saw her as an equal romantic partner as he would have a potential wife. The day Norcom noticed Harriet was pregnant, Norcom became furious, and Harriet recounts that he cut her hair close to mark her as a whore. And when she dared protest, he beat her, and then seeing she was hurt, left swearing not to hit her again. So we see this manipulation and coercion through him. In his eyes, her pregnancy was an intolerable affront to his authority. So in having a relationship with Sawyer, Harriet, in her small way, exercised her personal agency in choosing her partner, since she had been denied the marriage she wanted and had endured Dr. Norcom's harassment. Her choice, of course, was a man of higher social standing than Dr. Norcom, and this higher standing shielded Sawyer and Harriet from possible retribution by Norcom, as he would have been essentially shamed for admitting it. So if he had publicly acknowledged their relationship, he would be admitting that his enslaved person was having a relationship with someone that Norcom had little to no control over. An upper-class white enslaver was expected at this time to have complete control over his or her enslaved person, so any actions by those enslaved persons would be seen as, by the community, as reflecting upon their enslavers. So of course, Dr. Norcom wanted complete control over Harriet. Harriet continued to refuse Dr. Norcom's advances, so Dr. Norcom retaliated by sending Harriet to his son's plantation in 1835. She was sent here to prepare the home for the arrival of the bride, Dr. Norcom's daughter-in-law. So this is The home, which is no longer standing, in fact, you can see is in quite rough shape in 1966. This was the home of Dr. Norcom's son and daughter-in-law. So in a further attempt by Dr. Norcom to force Harriet to submit, he threatened to send her children to join her on the plantation. Harriet knew that being forced to work agricultural labor was much more difficult than a life of domestic labor or even a trade. So before her children could be sent, Harriet escaped Auburn in June 1835 and went into hiding. For her first 2 months in hiding, Harriet hid in the homes of several friends, both Black and white, while Dr. Norcom searched for her both in Edenton and New York. This is the actual ad that Dr. Norcom posted in the American Beacon just a few weeks after Harriet's escape. And in just a few moments, I will be looking at this in a little bit more detail. In an effort to bring Harriet out of hiding and to compel relatives to give up information, Dr. Norcom imprisoned Harriet's brother, 2 children, and her aunt in this very jail here, the 1825 Chowan County Jail. Harriet's aunt was released after 1 month at the request of her enslaver, but Harriet's brother and very young children, who were just 2 and 4 years old at the time, were held for 2 months in the 1825 Chowan County Jail. As agonizing as it was for Harriet to hear her children were imprisoned, it was safer for all for her to remain in hiding. She was resolved to win her freedom so that she could eventually win her children's. After Harriet's children were released from prison, Sawyer, the father of her children, managed to secretly purchase his and Harriet's children from Dr. Norcom and allowed them to live with Harriet's grandmother, Molly. So I want to bring attention back to the ad posted for Harriet's return, just to point out some interesting things here. These types of runaway ads can actually be really useful to us to learn about enslaved people today. We are lucky that we have 2 photographs of Harriet Jacobs, but this ad would give us an excellent idea of who she was, how she dressed, how she held herself. And I want to look at this quote here. Being a good seamstress, she has been accustomed to dress well, has a variety of very fine clothes made in the prevailing fashion, and will probably appear, if abroad, tricked out in gay and fashionable finery. So this shows to us that Harriet was a wonderful seamstress, and this is a skill that would support her after her escape to the North. This also goes against the idea that many of us may have that enslaved people didn't want or care for the finer things in life. At least it's not something that's usually recorded. This also, this is the idea of Cynthia Good. She argues that this is a form of resistive consumption. The idea that enslaved women would purchase higher priced goods even though they weren't necessary for survival. And this provided a means through which women who were used for their labor in a capitalist system in turn used the same system to reassert their humanity and personhood, meaning that they were proving themselves to be important consumers. And we can see this in Harriet Jacobs and in her grandmother, Molly Horniblow. Molly Horniblow, this is not her here. We do not have an image of her, unfortunately. Molly Horniblow was a socially well-respected woman who was manumitted through the Chowan County Courthouse, pictured here, which is still standing. Molly was well known for her expertise as a baker and made enough money to purchase her own house. It was a 7-room house situated within a predominantly white, affluent area, and neighbors were some of the wealthiest enslavers in the community. So it speaks to her social standing that she was able to purchase this house. After 2 months of hiding in various houses and even a swamp, Harriet's uncle managed to create a hidden trapdoor leading to the roof overhang of Molly's house, which we have pictured here. The space was 9 feet by 7 feet and 3 feet high at the highest point as the ceiling sloped down to the floor. So we see here, this little space is where she was hidden. In the top left is a little bit more of a 3D imaging of her hiding spot. So this was not only a miserably small space to be confined to, but Harriet also had no protection from the weather. It was hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and leaked when it rained. The exposure she endured in this roof space caused her to be sick very often and would affect her for the rest of her life. However, the family couldn't risk bringing in a doctor while she was in hiding. So at one point, she was so sick that her brother, John, pretended to have her symptoms in order to obtain treatment. The whole time she was in hiding, Harriet's children, even though they were living in the house, did not know that she was there. It was safer for them not to know where she was in case they were questioned. But she was able to drill a peephole about the size of a quarter to look out into the street and see her children as they came in and out of the house. However, Dr. Norcombe's office was on the corner of East King and Broad Streets, which was just down the road from the house. So Harriet could also see her enslaver, who was actively looking for her, walking in front of the house, in front of the spot right where she was hiding. She kept herself busy as much as she could, especially around Christmas, by sewing clothing and playthings for her children. And she laments in her autobiography that she was not able to experience their joy on Christmas morning, but she could at least give them something. During this whole time, Harriet's family were constantly on the lookout for a means of escape, but this was not easy. And it wasn't until almost 7 years later that Harriet self-emancipated and her chance came. So she was hiding in this attic space almost 7 years. Harriet never did divulge the details of her escape. She revealed only that after almost 7 years, an opportunity for freedom presented itself. It was quite dangerous for anyone to provide refuge for self-emancipated persons. Laws prohibiting the hiding of fugitive slaves included fines and imprisonment. And typically, enslaved persons who self-emancipated would make their way to port towns like Edenton, where free and enslaved sailors and stevedores might aid them in their escape to the northern free states. This was the fastest way, though not an easy way, for a freedom seeker to reach the free states in the north. Harriet's escape was, of course, successful, and we hear her emotion in the statement as she arrived in New York. Oh, the beautiful sunshine, the exhilarating breeze, and I could enjoy them without fear or restraint. I had never realized what grand things air and sunlight are till I had been deprived of them. Of course, this did not mean that Harriet had immediate and everlasting freedom, though I wish I could say so. She was haunted and hunted for many years after her arrival in New York by her enslavers who endeavored to force her back into enslavement. New York State abolished slavery within its borders in 1827, but Black New Yorkers remained in danger of enslavement or re-enslavement through widespread kidnapping conspiracies and crimes of opportunity. David Ruggles created an organization of Black and white New Yorkers and formed the New York Committee of Vigilance. They assembled a network of safe houses and churches that became stops on the Underground Railroad. Funds were raised to shelter, clothe, and feed freedom seekers, as well as to pay for lawyers in the jury trials for Black New Yorkers who had been arrested as fugitives. When Harriet was connected with the Vigilant Committee in New York to assist her in getting settled, she revealed her children's parentage to the man that was assigned to help her. This same man who heard her story advised Harriet against divulging her sexual history. He warned that some might treat her with contempt. And as we can understand, this upset Harriet very deeply. This was actually a primary reason that Harriet didn't join the anti-slavery movement sooner than she did. She felt that she could not be honest and tell the whole truth about her life. But soon after arriving, Harriet saw an ad for a baby nurse to Nathaniel Parker Willis, a famous author and magazinist, and Mary Staggs Willis was his wife. Harriet met with Mary and was given a trial period of 1 week, which lasted much longer. Luckily for Harriet, she was not asked to provide references, and it would never be revealed to Mary that Harriet was considered a fugitive from slavery. Harriet, unfortunately, had chronic pain and swelling from her years in hiding in a roof space that made it difficult for her to run around and up and down stairs after a toddler, as I'm sure some of you out there can imagine. Mary was kind enough not only to reorganize the baby's schedule to keep Harriet from having to run up and down stairs, but also called in a doctor to help treat her symptoms. During her time as a caregiver for the Willis's child, Harriet wondered how to permanently reunite with her daughter, Louisa. Once Harriet made it to New York, she was reunited with her daughter, but dismayed that Louisa was not treated as well as she had hoped, first seeing that she was not clothed appropriately for the cold weather, wearing a thin summer dress in the winter. Louisa had also not been educated, even though this was the agreement between Harriet and Sawyer for him to take Louisa north with his family. Harriet later also found out that Louisa had experienced sexual harassment herself at the hand of her enslaver's brother. Harriet refused to leave her daughter with this family, and it worked out as the family later moved back to North Carolina. And if Harriet had not insisted that Louisa move to Boston with her, Louisa would now be enslaved in North Carolina. Soon after this reunion, though, too soon, Harriet's world was thrown into upheaval by the death of Mary Willis. Mr. Willis was grieving and wanted to take his and Mary's daughter that Harriet had been caring for to England and take Harriet with them. Harriet's visit to England was a stark contrast to her experiences in the United States. Here, she didn't have the same reaction as Mr. Willis, who balked at the toil of the English working man. Harriet said, "The people I saw around me were many of them among the poorest poor. But when I visited them in their little thatched cottages, I felt that the condition of even the meanest and most ignorant among them was vastly superior to the condition of the most favored slaves in America." Harriet left England with the Willises after just 2 short weeks, but we can see here from this quote how much of an impact it had on her mental well-being. After returning from England, Harriet goes to live in Boston with her brother, John. Her brother, John, is highly active at this time in the abolitionist movement. Harriet very likely attended speeches and meetings. However, her involvement with abolitionist Boston is unclear. She was a fairly successful seamstress, so she was able to support herself and her daughter through that. While in Boston, Mary Matilda, who is Harriet's former enslaver, wrote to Harriet reminding her that she did not agree to sell Harriet and that she could either come back or purchase herself. Harriet felt safe among those in Boston to prevent her kidnapping, and Harriet chose to settle in Boston because, as this quote says, her old master was rather skittish of Massachusetts, and Harriet relied on Massachusetts' love of freedom and felt safe in its soil. Harriet and her brother John decided to send Louisa to Clinton, New York for school. And at this time, Harriet feels a little distressed at this separation and actually explains her story to Louisa. But Louisa says she already knew. She had been told as soon as her biological father, Sawyer, took her north. And tragically, Louisa wondered why Sawyer, quote, had no smiles for her, end quote, even though he was her father. But she had the love of her mother, and that was all that mattered to Louisa. In early 1849, Harriet moved to Rochester to be closer to her daughter's school and to work with her brother in running the anti-slavery reading room. This is what is pictured here in this building, what was the former reading room. John organized and directed the reading room, but when Harriet arrived, he asked her to oversee it as he was out of town for extended periods of time for speaking engagements. The anti-slavery office and reading room was located in rooms over those housing Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. In this office, anyone could, quote, gain information in regards to the progress of our cause and supply themselves with books and pamphlets. So the reading room only stayed open about 1 year, but it was during that time that Harriet started seriously thinking about writing her own story, and she was experimenting with telling it to her friends in Rochester. One of her closest friends was none other than famous abolitionist Amy Post. Harriet found a sincere friend in her, and perhaps even saw something of the relationship she used to have with her grandmother. Over time, Harriet told Amy bits and pieces of her story, as Amy recounts later, never without agonized tears. Amy Post allowed Harriet to tell her story in her own time, feeling that, quote, her story was too sacred to be drawn from her by inquisitive questions. In February of 1852, Harriet's peace was once again shattered when she discovered that she was being followed by Dr. Norcom's son. Dr. Norcom had passed away 2 years before in 1850, and now his children were attempting to follow through on his threats to re-enslave Harriet. At this point, Nathaniel Parker Willis had remarried to Cornelia Grinnell, who is pictured here very late in life. And Harriet became good friends with her and caregiver to his and Cornelia's children. Harriet did eventually confess to Cornelia that she had self-emancipated and therefore was considered to be a fugitive to the law. Cornelia sympathized with Harriet and managed to turn away Dr. Norcom's son, who was coming to her house to inquire after Harriet, and begged Harriet to leave the city. But Harriet wouldn't leave without her children. So to end the harassment, Cornelia offered Dr. Norcom's son to buy Harriet's freedom, which she did. Harriet understandably had mixed feelings about her freedom being purchased. She was ultimately grateful and felt as if a heavy load had been lifted from her shoulders. However, she still felt like a piece of merchandise, finding it hard to grasp that even in this free state of New York, she had been sold as property. She says this of the transaction, quote, to pay money to those who had so grievously oppressed me seems like taking from my sufferings the glory of triumph. Her escape to New York wasn't enough to earn her freedom. The bonds of slavery still labeled her as property. She wrote later in a letter to Amy Post, the freedom I had before the money was paid was dearer to me. God gave me that freedom, but man put God's image in the scales with the paltry sum of $300. After this, Harriet felt more free to be able to tell her story. She reached out to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had recently published Uncle Tom's Cabin, but was told that she should write her own story rather than having Stowe write it. After this rejection, Harriet came across a publication titled The Women of England versus the Women of America. And this, it seems, will become the catalyst for Harriet to write her own narrative. She was upset over Harriet Beecher Stowe's rejection, but absolutely outraged at this publication that claimed enslaved people in the South were treated very well and only very rarely separated from their loved ones. This, of course, could not be further from the truth, as Harriet had first-hand experience with. Roughly half of all enslaved people were separated from their spouses and parents. About 1 in 4 of those sold were children. Slaveholders threatened separation to maintain control, forcing enslaved people to live with the constant fear of losing a loved one. Even those who were not traded across regions could be sold away from relatives at an owner's whim to divide an estate, settle a debt, or as punishment. Harriet immediately writes a response to this publication and is titled Letter from a Fugitive Slave, and signs it a fugitive slave, which is here at the bottom. Harriet directly called out white male enslavers who sexually abused their enslaved women, only to toss them aside at their convenience and begin again with yet another victim, as is shown here in the quote. Hearing a defense of chattel slavery was Harriet's impetus to write incidents in the life of a slave girl. She says, "Poor as it may be, I had rather give it from my own hand," meaning her own narrative, "than have it said that I employed others to do it through me. The truth can never be told so well through the second and third person as from yourself." So she attempted first to get it printed in England, but for reasons not quite understood, her narrative there was rejected. They refused to publish it. She tried again in America and connected with Lydia Marie Child, another famous abolitionist, to edit her writing. In addition to editing the text, Lydia wrote an introduction and assumed the role of Harriet's agent. Harriet had chosen in her narrative not to dwell on Dr. Norcombe's torture, but on Harriet's own defiance. She had composed her story with the reader in mind, that being a free woman who had no experience with a sexual history of her own. Harriet, like all slave narrators, would shape her book with both a public agenda to forge her story as a weapon against the slave system, and with an autobiographer's private agenda to convince her readers to understand and sympathize with her. Her narrative was published in America in 1861, and the next year was published in England under the title The Deeper Wrong, which is here on the left-hand side. Her book was, of course, just coming into print at the start of the Civil War. In late 1861, after the Battle of Port Royal, Harriet made the decision to assist in the war effort. She went down to Washington, taking with her bundles of clothing, blankets, and shoes that she had been collecting from sympathetic donors over the winter. Through most of the Civil War years, Harriet lived in or near Washington, D.C., and aided contrabands, nursed Black troops, and operated a school with her daughter. Harriet continued to write pieces for publication, speaking out on behalf of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people, highlighting the abysmal conditions of refugee camps, especially in Washington, D.C., and the racism and mistreatment experienced by formerly enslaved people seeking refuge. She quotes, "Oh, when will the white man know the hearts of my abused and suffering people?" In 1863, Harriet saw the need for a free school under Black leadership where the destitute refugees could send their children to learn. So this school was established in Alexandria, Virginia in 1863. As you can see here, and in the not quite good quality blow up, this is the second of only two known pictures that we have of Harriet Jacobs. And here she is in front of her school in Alexandria, Virginia. In 1865, 2 years later, Harriet and Louisa traveled to Savannah, Georgia, to help freedmen, where Louisa, her daughter, set up another school and stayed to teach when Harriet left for home in New York. Harriet did return to Edenton in 1867 and found it much different than she left it. Her grandmother's house was no longer owned by the family, and she wrote a letter stating, "I am sitting under the old roof 12 feet from the spot where I suffered all the crushing weight of slavery." Harriet went back to see if she could live in Edenton, but found that she could not. Settled in Cambridge, she began running a boarding house, and a few years later, she and Louisa moved to Washington, D.C., but an economic depression kept Louisa from finding employment as a teacher, which is what Harriet and Louisa both wanted. So together, Harriet and Louisa opened another boarding house in Washington, D.C. Harriet would open several more over the next decade or so. In 1894, Harriet, who was already suffering from various other conditions, was diagnosed with breast cancer. She did undergo surgery, and despite her age, she was recovered. Louisa acted as her full-time nurse, and even Cornelia Willis, who is the one who purchased Harriet's freedom, assisted her in moving into a new home and reached out to friends of Harriet's and hers for help with the medical expenses. In late 1896, Harriet fell from her wheelchair and injured her hip, and it was shortly after, on March 7th, 1897, that Harriet Jacobs passed away. Unfortunately, Harriet's narrative was largely forgotten for nearly a century, and her writings had even been considered a fiction written by Lydia Marie Child. However, her work, writings, and papers have thankfully survived and are considered to be the only papers of a woman held in American slavery known to have survived. In Harriet's story, I see her defiance and resistance. She is refused a marriage with a free Black man who was unknown. So she forms a relationship with Samuel Sawyer, with whom she has 2 children. She escapes slavery. She swallows her pride and asks her enslaver multiple times to free her so she will worry less about the future of her children. She protects and provides for her children even after being separated from them. She writes her own narrative. And this is, of course, her reliving her trauma and risking negative feelings towards herself and her experiences in order to tell her story. So I hope today's presentation inspired you in more ways than one. And I thank you all for being here and to learn about this incredible woman. I'll leave you with this quote here. This is a letter from Harriet to Amy Post discussing writing her autobiography. She says, "You shall have truth, but not talent. God did not give me that gift, but he gave me a soul that burned for freedom and a heart nourished with determination to suffer even unto death in pursuit of that liberty, which without makes life an intolerable burden." Thank you. Yes. All right. You have a question? Yes.
Yeah, actually I have 2. The first one you said she took the name Jacobs. You may have said, and I might have missed it.
Yeah.
What time frame did she take this name?
She took it after her father passed away, and I apologize, I can't remember the year her father passed away. I don't have it here,
Okay.
but she took it the year her father passed away. It was in honor of her father, who was, however, sired by a white man. She still took this last name.
Right, but so it was before she self-emancipated.
Yes.
Okay. And the second question I had was she was accustomed to the finer garments. Her source of income, what was it?
It was partly her domestic labor. She could sell things like dolls. She could offer her services as a seamstress. From what we know, that's what she was able to use. And even, women at this time, even if it was more money than they had to spare, they wouldn't mind spending a little bit more to buy the finer things just to kind of assert themselves in their community.
But do we have records of dollar figures?
Not to my knowledge. Yes.
Harriet buried?
She's buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Does she still have are there any lineage or relatives still living down the line?
Unfortunately, not direct descendants. Her children, as far as we know, Louisa Matilda Jacobs, she never married and never had children. Joseph Jacobs is a little bit of a mystery. In the 1860s, he went to California to follow the gold rush, and then went to Australia after that. And his trail goes cold after that, unfortunately. In the late 1860s, I believe, he wrote a letter to Harriet asking, well, it was claimed to be from him. There is speculation that it may have been someone reaching out to Harriet to essentially swindle her. He asked for $400. Harriet sent the $400 to Australia and never heard from him again. So we don't know if her son ever married or had children, but there is no record of it, unfortunately. So her direct descendants are not around anymore. Yes, ma'am.
Of where she stayed on her family property.
Yeah, so there are some sites surviving. Unfortunately, the house of her grandmother's, her grandmother's house is no longer surviving. It is currently a parking lot. A bank on the corner replaced it. Dr. Norcom's house is no longer surviving. Samuel Sawyer's house is no longer there. We do know where they were in town, and they were all within a block of each other. And we do give tours at Historic Edenton. I have a coworker who likes to use the term mental landscape. When we take the tour, we create a mental landscape of Harriet's years in Edenton, how close everything was together. Again, like I get chills when I think about Dr. Norcom walking right by Harriet's hiding space, which I'll put up here. You see here, this part here would have faced the road, so she would have been able to see Dr. Norcom go by. The sites that we have are the 1825 Towan County Jail, where her children and her brother were imprisoned, and the historic courthouse where her grandmother was manumitted. And it's been theorized by some that if Molly Horniblow had not been manumitted, she would not have been able to successfully hide Harriet long enough for her to be able to escape. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What year the house on West Eaton Street was torn down? I used to live on Eaton Street, and it was 4 houses down. I remember it as a small child.
Okay.
I don't know what year it was torn down.
Unfortunately, I don't know that either. I would be willing to guess it was the maybe 1970s or 80s, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Yeah, that I don't know for sure. Was it in the 90s?
Parking lot by the True Value Hardware store.
Okay.
There's a marker in the parking lot. I'm not sure. I haven't looked in.
Okay. Yeah. Any more questions?
Behind 5 always, those 3.
Let's see here. The house itself is, if I can get to it, here we are. This is now a parking lot for church. It's now a church parking lot where this house used to be. So it is on West Eaton Street, but I don't know when it was torn down.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, that's Dr. Norcom's house. Yeah, we don't, yes, so we also don't know what year the house was that she hid in was torn down. Molly Horniblow purchased the house. She wasn't able to purchase it on her own, so we believe that she had sort of like co-signers. I can't remember what the exact term was, but we'll use that for now, to help her purchase the house and give her essentially social standing that she could buy the house. And it's possible that the family, after Molly Horniblow's son passed away, her son's widow was still living in the house and was kicked out. This probably would have been the 1850s or 60s. And by the time Harriet went back in 1867, the house was still there. But sometime after that, it was torn down, but we don't know exactly when it was torn down. Yeah, which is quite unfortunate. Yes, ma'am.
So none of even none of those, then it's just still living, I guess.
The white side.
Are you asking about descendants of them? There are quite a lot of descendants of Dr. Norcom. He had, I think, 2 wives at least, and multiple illegitimate children with enslaved women. So they're kind of all over the place, but his family tree I'm not familiar with. But there are still Dr. Norcom's descendants, plenty of them. Yeah.
No,
That's okay.
white side of Harriet's lineage.
Oh, I see. Harriet was, her parents were both African American enslaved. Let me go back to the family tree to help myself remember. Molly Horniblow was fathered by, here we are. So Molly Horniblow was fathered by a white man. She actually has her own interesting story, which I think for time's sake I probably won't go into now. But she, we don't know who Harriet's grandfather was. As you can see, we have a question mark next to Molly Horniblow. Again, African Americans' lineage at this time is very sparse. They did not do well with record keeping. As for Harriet's white side of her family, I don't quite know what happened to them. The probably closest relative would be her great grandfather at this time. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Have been no DNA testing.
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge, yeah. Doesn't say that that can't be done. That would be quite exciting. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate you for coming out, and I appreciate everyone who came out virtually as well. Thank you.